Welcome to Chapter 8. In Chapter 8, we discuss the state of education in the United States, its purpose, how we're doing, and ways we can change it. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, one of the things that I want to start out with is the fact that as people of the United States, we really like education. Like, education is something that pretty much everyone is a strong believer in. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican or anarchists or communitarian, like Americans really believe that education is a positive thing. They want to support it. They believe that many of the problems that we're seeing today in the United States can be solved through education. In fact, I would challenge you to come up with a problem, a social problem or other problem that we have that people don't suggest education as the solution. I mean, if you think about things we've talked about already, like racism and homophobia and poverty, pretty much everybody is going to say that the solution to all these problems, at least one of the solutions, is to increase education. So, overall, we are fans of education. So let's talk about how we're doing in this arena that we as citizens believe in so strong. So, one of the purposes of education that we have is, first of all, to train. You know, if we ask people, what is the purpose of education? Most people will think about, well, you want to train people for the working world, right? Giving them job skills, training them how to behave in the workforce, how to show up on time, how to listen to their boss, how to read instructions, how to think critically, things of that nature. It is also looked upon to help people become sort of Americans in the sense that we are a nation of immigrants and we look to the education system heavily to make people who are not Americans, not legally Americans, but we look to sort of make them English speakers, for instance, and we teach them the culture of America. We teach them the Constitution of the United States, and we teach them a lot of things that we think of as, hey, if you're going to get along here, here are the things that you need to know. And language is probably one of the biggest parts for these children. You know, if you think about if you're a 6-year-old and you come to this country from another country, you are thrust into an environment where probably the things that you were used to in your old country are no longer considered socially not they're not considered socially cool anymore, and so you have to kind of figure out what is cool in the new environment, and by and large people adjust, people adapt. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's not a good thing, but we want to be like the people around us. We want the people around us to think that we are good and acceptable people. And so the school environment often plays that role of socializing students. And that's not even formal, at least some of it is, but meaning a lot of it comes through just the school children themselves. They look at other children who are different from them, and they say that's bad because it's different, and for better or worse, the students adapt and become like the students around them. So, and I say that's maybe bad or good because some of the old culture is probably a good thing. Like treating your elders with respect. As Americans, we struggle with that, but other cultures are much better than that. So that's unfortunate if students would lose those. But other things like beliefs that women are inferior, then they're going to pick up things that say, no, actually, women are equal to men. And so that would be a positive thing that we would pass along in the informal school environment, right? And then, of course, teachers play a kind of a different role. They're going to be teaching English and obedience to the rules and hierarchy of authority and turning in homework on time. So we also look to education as the primary ticket that people have out of poverty. Thinking about the immigrant, but you don't have to think about an immigrant. You could think about a child who, his parents are poor, working retail jobs, and the child, is growing up poor. But if he or she does well in school and applies themselves and has a vision for the future, then they can get out of poverty, because education, ideally, at least in our minds, is a level playing field. So it doesn't matter if your parents are rich or poor or smart or not, then you are graded based upon your performance. So if you will be diligent and do well, then you can get an A, and then you can go on to university and study medicine and become a doctor and no longer be poor. So, all right. So we are strong believers in education, and yet in some ways we are falling behind as a nation, where other countries are now passing us in areas like math, science, and writing. All right, looking at the numbers, about 88% of Americans have a high school diploma or more, right? So that means about 12% don't have a high school diploma or the equivalent thereof. And then about 32% of us, which is about 1 out of every 3 Americans, has at least a bachelor's degree. So if you're working toward a bachelor's degree and you achieve that, you will actually be in the minority, kind of the elite educated minority in the United States. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to talk about education from the various perspectives, starting with functionalism. Answering the question of what is the purpose of education, the purpose of education, according to functionalism, is to train future workers. You're socializing them into the ways of work in the United States. It is going to help people develop personally. They're in school, maybe they're struggling in writing an essay, they apply themselves, they learn diligence, they get help, they try new things, and then they succeed. Well, those are great skills, not even just for essays, but just for life in general. And that applies very well in the work world, in their personal lives, in their relationships. As a nation, we have an amount of knowledge about how to do things, how to build cars, how to type and use computers. You have to pass this on to the next generation, otherwise eventually you'll lose that information. And so education is necessary to pass on the collective knowledge of a society onto the next generation. Those are sort of the intended functions of education. But there are also unintended functions that also benefit us. For instance, we started education, public education, to train people for work. What we didn't do it for was for free babysitting. However, it has become that, right? It's not a bad thing. Now that both men and women are both partners in most marriages or committed relationships where children are involved, both of them often work. And so schools function to care for children while parents are at work. So that again was not the purpose of education, but it's a benefit that has been added to it, and it has allowed economic growth. Without the education system being there, watching children, perhaps women would not have been able to enter the workforce in large numbers like they have in the 1970s and the 1980s. So, on the other hand, and again, we're still in functionalism here, perhaps we are over-relying on the education system. According to functionalism, when one part of society begins to struggle, then other parts of society kind of pick up the slack. And so some functionalists would say that we have over-relied on the education system to do things like parent children, so that today, they're doing feeding and they're clothing and they're doing sex education and money education and trying to teach character and motivational speakers and all these things, and that's taken away from the school's ability to teach the things that we think of like math and science and writing. And so perhaps that's become a problem, and one of the reasons why other countries are competing with us, and some of them are surpassing us, because we're just asking too much of schools today. Okay, well, let's talk about the purpose of education from a conflict perspective. So a conflict perspective says that basically everything exists to benefit the wealthy. And so how does education systems benefit the wealthy? Well, the education system serves to divide those who have from those who don't have, right? And the education system indoctrinates, and so it teaches us and keeps us from questioning why things are the way they are. Why do we have a few people on the very top of our society with so much, and the vast majority of us, just have a little, and many of us are struggling just to get by. And so the education system is what teaches us that this is okay, that this is natural, this is normal, that any other system or way of doing things would be way worse, right? So that most of us, we're not marching in the streets, we're not rebelling, we're not asking why our bosses make 10 times more than we are. We're just kind of going through the system because the education system has taught us that this is the way things are supposed to be, and that if we'll play our cards right, then maybe one day we will be the boss making 10 times more than everybody else. So the conflict theory is a little bit more cynical, if you haven't noticed, that basically, it is about teaching us to embrace the system that is holding us down, And so if you look at schools, again, we're still in conflict theory here. If you look at schools, they are a system of rules and structures that mirror many jobs. Now, this was more true back 100 years ago when a lot of Americans were working in factories. And schools had a lot more ringing bells, and there was a lot more emphasis on being on time and dressing in an appropriate way and kind of following the rules. I think there's a little bit less of that today than there used to be. But if you can kind of imagine a school environment where the child comes in and they are divided based upon their date of manufacture, right, so to speak, your age, that's what you put, how students are grouped together, and then they are, put in one classroom environment until the bell rings, and then they're moving to another classroom environment. And the most important thing is following the rules and doing what is expected, right? And so that kind of that manner mirrors a factory environment where you have ringing bells and you have, an assembly line, and it's not about being creative or really even thinking that much. It's just about following directions. And the closer you can get to the ideal, the right answer, then the better things are. And so, why do we teach students to read and write? Well, the factory owners need people to be able to read directions and write about what happened if something goes wrong. And so that's why they teach those things. So, rich schools are different from poor schools. And according to conflict theory, the reason for this is because the schools of the rich are training tomorrow's leaders, and the schools of the poor are training tomorrow's followers. And so if you look at a rich school, what they emphasize is freedom, and the interactions between the students and the teachers is much more informal. There's a lot more bending of the rules. There's a lot more leeway in terms of what students are able to get away with. And what is taught is creativity, encouraging students to take leadership opportunities and sort of figure out their own path, their own way of doing things, their own way of controlling their own lives, their own assignments. because these students are going to grow up to be tomorrow's leaders. And so nobody chides the boss for being late or smoking in his or her office. What a boss does need to do well is do leadership, to control and manage other people. And so that is what is taught in the school. Now, very different story if you go to a school full of the children of the poor. Their emphasis is on appearance. It's upon looking the part. It's based upon obedience, following the rules. And why is this? Well, because the theory goes, when those students grow up, they are going to be in roles at work that mirror the school. The poor are rewarded based upon their ability to follow the rules and do what is told of them, do what they're told. Not being creative, not being in leadership, not necessarily even thinking, because the thinking is what's done by the people in leadership, unfortunately, or at least the thinking that matters within an organization. If you look at how new ideas, come about within most job structures, they come about because somebody at the top of the leadership has an idea, and then it trickles down to the rest of the organization. It typically does not start at the bottom and trickle up. Ironically, when they hire consultants, what consultants often do is that they go to the bottom of the organization and they interview people who are doing the day-to-day building, doing the day-to-day service that the job actually is about. And then the consultant, writes down basically the thoughts and the observations and the way that the business could do better from the perspective of the people on the very bottom, and then they write that up in a report and send it to the people at the top, and then the people at the top are like, wow, this is amazing, this consultant is so smart, and then they may or may not implement some of those changes. And so, this is unfortunate, because if you have children of the poor who are looking to move up and be the boss or even middle manager, it's difficult because their school didn't emphasize any of the skills that would have been required to do those jobs well. All right. We may think of rich parents as having more resources to be able to buy their children computers and go on field trips and that sort of thing. And that obviously is true, but it goes beyond that. Children who grow up in richer households, they're more likely to have a home environment that is conducive to doing well in school. Parents who have time and desire to read, even just for pleasure. And so when children see their parents reading for pleasure, they're more likely to read for pleasure. Reading for pleasure benefits students in numerous ways. When the children of the rich have the desire and the money to go to a museum or take private piano lessons, those also benefit children. So it's not just money. Some of it's also culture. Students, parents. Parents who have more money, this is middle class and upper class, they tend to have more belief in education. Therefore, they tend to spend more of their income as a percentage on education. So it's priority and it's money. Many poor people, obviously I'm speaking broadly, not everybody, but many poor people are they're uncomfortable with the educational settings. They are not, in their children's schools. They're not talking and interacting with their students, with their child's teachers. And so all these little things can add up to make a real difference in a student's life, whether they do well, whether they find the experience meaningful, or if they don't. All right, well, according to feminists, moving on to feminists and how they view education, the goal of education is to teach gender conformity. teach students what it means to act feminine for their girls and act masculine for their boys. That the education structure is gender biased. Girls in general tend to be called on less by their teachers, both male and female teachers. When they are called upon, it's more relating to the humanities, writing, reading, like that. But boys tend to be called on in general more, but more specifically when it comes to science and mathematics. Students that are doing well in math and science, that tends to be more like biologist. It tends to be more mathematician, engineer, things like that. And there's a pretty big difference between the income that a nurse has versus the income of an engineer. So that is one of the reasons why women make less money than men do. Here's something that I find interesting. If you think about a classroom full of kindergartners and you try to figure out, even when they're very young, how far any individual child is going to go in their education, and you might look at one child and say, okay, well, I think you're going to go on and get a master's degree. And you look at another child and say, you're probably going to finish high school and that will be it. It's difficult to obviously to approximate how far people are going to go, but I would naturally assume that the smart students, and again, smart is difficult to even define. I mean, when someone says smart, do they mean socially smart? Do they mean street smart? Do they mean financially smart? Do they mean book smart? Do they mean athletic smart? You could keep going on and on. But I think of smart as being just their ability. How quickly do they pick up new information? How fast can they take information and understand it and reproduce it? How fast can they teach it to somebody else? That kind of thing. And so I think about the smarter students being able to, or had the best chance of going the farthest. So if a student is able to, figure out their ABCs, in a week, and another student it takes, say, 4 weeks, then I would assume that the student who figures it out in a week is probably going to go farther in education than the student that takes 4 weeks to. The problem is that's just not an accurate way. It's not a very good way of predicting how far someone's going to go. The best predictor of how far someone's going to go in their education is based upon how much money each child's parents have. Right? So the child whose parents are a doctor and the other parent is a lawyer, this child is likely going to go way farther than the child whose parents are, say, a CNA and the other one is, a truck driver. And so this is unfortunate, because what we're doing then is that we are saying that education isn't really about how well you do in school or your interest in school or your ability to do well in school. It's really based upon what your parents are like and what kind of jobs they have, your social class. And so, because I guess this is a big deal, because the farther someone goes in their education, the more likely they are going to have good jobs become available to them, the more likely that they are to have a middle-class lifestyle, not to be in poverty, and things of that nature. If just one statistic really fast, if you look at the amount of money that people make with a high school diploma or without a high school diploma, the difference is $10,000 per year. Where the person without a high school diploma, the median income for that person is $20,000, and the median income for the person with a high school diploma is $30,000. And so that, at most, that's only a 4-year difference. If the person is able to drop out their freshman year. But I don't think that's even possible in most states. I don't think you can drop out even until you're like 16 or 17 years old, which means you're more likely to be a junior or a senior. So that means really only 2 years of education separates the person with the high school diploma from the person that doesn't. So, but still, those 2 years, that's $10,000. All right, well, let's talk about how the education system is doing from more of a big picture perspective. The public in general desires that the education system be a place of discipline where students are following directions and a place of safety. Unfortunately, neither of those seems to be very true, where things like school shootings happen on a far too regular basis, and many teachers complain about students who are not following directions, not being disciplined. On the other hand, education reformers desire that all students, or at least the vast majority of students, have access to a high quality education, and that the standards that each individual school is held to are the same, and that students be exposed to a multicultural education experience. Before President Clinton was in office, and he was in office in the 90s, individual schools were sort of held to their own standards, meaning an individual school could kind of decide what they wanted to focus on, or if they wanted their school curriculum to be a little bit different from the school, on the neighboring town. But under President Clinton, the schools became more standardized, where schools in Seattle would be the same as schools in Illinois, and schools in big cities would be similar to schools in small towns. And so there's a lot of people who, on the surface, this change is a positive thing because it kind of calls all schools to account, saying you can't lower your standards just because you don't feel like people in the community desire them to be more stringent. But on the other hand, a lot of schools feel like their ability to control what their students learn, what they need to know about, has been taken away from them, and they're now teaching something that they kind of feel disconnected from. Other themes that have occurred over the past few decades, in addition to school standards being the same or at least similar across the board, are things like choice for students. Under George W. Bush, there was an education bill passed called No Child Left Behind. And what that did was it introduced the ability for students to choose which school that they wanted to go to, especially if the school that they were attending wasn't doing well academically. And the way that they knew that students weren't doing well academically was based upon tests that were given to students every year, which are not very popular things, and a lot of parents and teachers really resent the emphasis on testing that occurs within the schools. Okay, so those are some of the things that we have done recently to try to improve the education experience in the United States. Believe it or not, and the reason I say that is because many people don't appreciate the changes that have occurred, but the spirit of them was to make education in the United States better, across the board. But many people feel like it has not addressed the core issue. So let's talk about some of the other things that we've been doing to try to address the education experience within the United States. One of them is the Head Start program, which was started, I believe, around the time of World War II. Head Start is the largest early childhood program in the United States. It's, you think about the word Head Start. The idea is that it gives a child a head start in school. So it takes children who are too young to attend kindergarten, and it's a program that in some ways is like a school, but it's geared toward younger children. And the results are positive, so that when they look at students who have attended Head Start, when they're, say, in kindergarten or first grade, and they look at the students who have not attended Head Start or some sort of similar program, the students tend to do better. They tend to be better prepared for school than those who have not been through a program. Violence has become a part of school environments, unfortunately. I believe that violence has kind of always been in schools. It's just now something that we're much more aware of. But it's more than that. The prevalence of firearms and people's access to them has increased, and so has the news coverage of violent acts that occur in school. And as a result of this, there have been several actions that have been taken by schools. One of them is that there are many more police in schools than there were in the past. Having a police presence is believed to make students feel more secure. It's also thought to deter violent actions by students who would otherwise commit violent acts while at school. Schools have also started doing a lot more anti-bullying programs. These would be things like teaching students ways of dealing with conflict other than using violence. They're doing things like peer juries. So whereas, most of the time when students get in trouble, they're pulled in front of administrators, and the administrators kind of decide their fate. But a peer jury is other students who would sort of hear the case of the students. If a student does something wrong, rather than going in front of an administrator, they would go before other students, and then the other students would kind of decide what their punishment should be, or who was right and wrong in this case. Changing course here for a second, we mentioned some of the reforms that have taken place through No Child Left Behind, that being school choice, meaning that children can choose to go to one school or the other. The idea behind this was that if schools knew that they could lose customers by not providing a good educational experience, then they would improve the quality of their product, right? So it was sort of introducing some of like the capitalist ideas, Pizza Hut and Domino's. If they're both competing against each other, then they're both going to provide a better product. So they were kind of doing that in a school environment. The idea that schools needed motivation to provide an educational experience that was appropriate. And so charter schools are another thing that has cropped up in large numbers in the United States. It's fairly new. Charter schools are schools that are public. Well, they're taking public money, taxpayer dollars, and they are given to manage. It's privately managing a school. So you're bypassing some of the laws and rules that other public schools have to abide by. And so, again, it kind of creates a choice so that students who want to go to this charter school rather than going to their traditional public school have the opportunity to apply to go to these. The idea being that it was, again, creating competition amongst the schools. It also was giving students a choice. Do they want to go to a new school, or do they want to go, back to their public school? The problem with charter schools is that they are selective in the students that they accept, and their effectiveness is questionable. Some studies show that charter schools produce better student results. Some studies say that they're fairly similar. Some say they're a little bit worse. But one thing is sure, is that the children of the poor tend not to go to the charter schools as much. So that's unfortunate because the idea was that it was going to be something that a student from a poorly performing school would be able to achieve, but the charter schools tend to not be for the poorest students. The poorest students don't even apply, or their parents don't really apply for them. That is my lecture for Chapter 8.